A man who disappears into his work long enough will eventually become invisible to the people standing right beside him. Aldous Fenwick understood this the way you understand weather. Not as something you chose, but as something that happened to you while you were busy doing other things. He was 42 years old, and he had spent the last 11 years building something that most people in his life had never bothered to look at closely. Not his wife, not her family, not the guests at their dinner parties who smiled at him over wine glasses and asked, in the particular tone people reserve for questions they already know the answer to, "And what is it you do again, Aldous?" "Cabinet maker," he would say. "Custom woodworking. Furniture, mostly." And they would nod the way people nod when they are already thinking about something else. What Renata did not know, what she had never once thought to ask, was that the man she introduced to her colleagues as "my husband the carpenter" had spent the last 8 years quietly building something far larger than the workshop on Lyard Street in Ottawa's Hintonburg neighborhood where he kept his tools. She was about to find out. On a Tuesday evening in March, with the kind of cold that settles into the Ottawa Valley and stays past its welcome, Aldous pushed open the front door of the house on Faraday Street, set his jacket on the hook, and heard his wife's voice before I saw anything. Low. Careful. The tone she used when she did not want to be overheard. He stood in the hallway. The kitchen light was on. Through the half-open door he could hear 2 voices, and the second one belonged to a man named Tristan Vogt. Aldous had met Tristan twice, once at Renata's office holiday party, once at a fundraiser for the Glebe Community Association. Both times, Tristan had shaken his hand with the particular firmness of a man who considers a handshake a form of competition. He worked in commercial real estate, drove a car that cost more than Aldous's first workshop, and had a way of speaking about money that made it sound like a personality. "The valuation is clean," Tristan was saying. "If the filing goes through the way we discussed, you'll come out with the house, the savings accounts, and grounds to claim a share of any business assets structured during the marriage." "He doesn't know anything about the legal side," Renata said. "He barely looks at the mail." A small silence. Then Tristan said something that Aldous did not fully hear because a sound had started somewhere behind his sternum. Not anger. Something quieter and more final. The particular sensation of a door closing inside a room you didn't know was still open. He walked back out to the garage, sat on the edge of the workbench his father had built from reclaimed Douglas fir in 1987, looked at the grain of the wood for a long time, not plotting, just becoming clear. Psychologists describe this as cognitive consolidation, the process by which the mind, confronted with information it has been half-sensing for a long time, finally integrates it into a coherent picture. It is not the same as shock. Shock is the response to the unexpected. What Aldous felt in that garage was closer to the relief of a diagnosis. You already knew something was wrong. Now you knew what. He had known for months. The warmth that had left the marriage in small increments, the way you lose feeling in a limb, gradually, and then all at once when you try to use it. The phone she angled away from him when she typed. The dinners she said were with colleagues. The way she had stopped asking about his work, which had once been the most reliable subject between them. He had told himself he was imagining it. He had been wrong about that. Aldous stayed in the garage for an hour. Then he came inside, made tea, and went to bed without saying anything to anyone. Some things need to be thought through before they are acted on. 3 days later, he drove to the offices of a woman named Hortense Quillen on Wellington Street West. Hortense was a corporate lawyer, 70 years old, with the demeanor of someone who has seen every version of human foolishness and stopped being surprised by any of it. She had been the one to help structure the agreement 8 years ago, when a man named Sylvester Fontaine had first approached Aldous about Northline Collective. Aldous had been 34 years old the first time he walked into the Fontaine family's manufacturing facility on Boundary Road in Carleton Place. Not as an investor, not yet. He had been there to repair a section of the original workshop floor, white oak planking that had warped over a winter of poor ventilation. He had done the job in 2 days, and Sylvester Fontaine had stood watching, with the focused interest of a man who recognizes quality when he sees it regardless of where it comes from. They had talked that afternoon, the way working men talk, in the language of materials and problems, and how things hold together over time. Sylvester had mentioned that his modular home construction company was expanding, that the custom millwork contracts alone were more than his current suppliers could handle, and that he had been looking for a partner with workshop capacity and a reliable eye for detail. Aldous had gone home and looked at his accounts. Then he had called his father. His father, Marcel Fenwick, had been a Finnish carpenter in Renfrew for 30 years. He had died the previous spring and left behind a modest house on Raglan Street, a set of tools that Aldous kept oiled and organized in the way you keep the things that matter, and a savings account that was modest by most standards and enormous by the standards of what it represented. A life's worth of careful, unhurried accumulation. Aldous had taken that inheritance and put it to work, over 8 years, redirecting revenue from the Lyard Street workshop, which had grown from a one-man operation into a 6-person custom furniture studio. With a 3-month waiting list, he had quietly acquired a significant position in Northline Collective. The company had expanded from residential modular homes into sustainable commercial construction, won several provincial contracts, and become, by the time Renata was being considered for a senior position at her architectural firm, one of the more successful mid-sized builders in eastern Ontario. She did not know. She knew he made furniture. She knew the workshop kept them comfortable. She did not know that his name appeared on documents she had never thought to look for, or that the ground beneath the life she had built was significantly supported by the man she was planning to leave. Psychologists call it the availability heuristic, the tendency to assess the significance of something based on how easily it comes to mind. Aldous arrived home, covered in sawdust. He smelled like wood stain and mineral spirits. He talked about joinery angles and grain direction at dinner. That was the available information, and Renata had used it, the way the mind always does, as a shortcut for the whole person. It was efficient, it was wrong. Hortense Quillen listened to everything Aldous told her. She asked 3 questions. She made 2 notes. Then she folded her hands on the desk in the unhurried way of a person who has already understood the situation and is simply waiting for you to catch up. "You have some decisions to make," she said, "about what you want to protect and what you want to let go." "I know what I want to protect," Aldous said. "It isn't the money." Hortense nodded once, which was as close as she came to approval. 2 weeks later, Aldous received an invitation that had been extended months ago, and which Renata had informed him, with the particular carefulness she used now when she wanted to manage his expectations, he would probably not enjoy. The annual recognition dinner for the Rideau Valley Heritage Build Initiative was being held at the Chateau Laurier on May 3rd. Renata's firm was a presenting sponsor. She was expected to attend with a representative from one of their major partners. "It's a long evening," she had said. "You'd be bored." "You're probably right," Aldous had said. He had let her believe it. The 4th of May was a Wednesday. By 8 in the morning, Aldous had already been in the workshop for 2 hours, working through the final stages of a commission. A white oak dining table, 8 feet long, hand-planed and oiled, for a family in Westboro who had been waiting 6 months and would wait 6 more without complaint because that was the kind of work it was. He finished the final pass with the hand plane, checked the surface against the light coming through the north window, and set the tool down with the precision of a man who respects his instruments. Then he showered, put on the gray suit he had picked up from a tailor on Bank Street the previous week without telling anyone why. Checked the watch his father had left him, the kind with no brand on the face, built to last rather than to be noticed. He drove his truck to the Chateau Laurier and parked on Colonel By Drive. When he walked into the ballroom, he was 40 minutes late, which was intentional. The room had settled. Dinner had been cleared. The program was underway. The woman at the registration table found his name and looked up at him with a small expression of surprise she did not quite conceal. "Mr. Fenwick, we weren't sure you were coming." "I wasn't either," he said, which was technically true. She handed him his name badge. He set it in his jacket pocket. Sylvester Fontaine was at the head table. He was 71 years old now, white-haired and steady, with the kind of calm that comes from having built things that lasted. He had known Aldous was coming. They had spoken the previous week, a conversation that had been brief and honest in the way of men who trust each other entirely. Aldous found a seat near the back and waited. Renata was at the third table from the front, in a wine-colored dress, her posture impeccable. Tristan Vogt sat beside her. He had his hand resting on the back of her chair in the particular way that is not quite touching, the gesture of a man who is making a claim he hasn't yet been authorized to make. Aldous watched them for a moment, not with anger. The anger, he had found, had mostly burned off in the garage on Faraday Street. What remained was something steadier. At 9 o'clock, Sylvester walked to the podium. The room settled immediately. There is a kind of attention a room gives to a person it genuinely respects, and it is different from the attention given to a person it is simply polite to. Sylvester received the first kind. "Before we proceed to the evening's final recognition," he said, "there is an acknowledgement I have wanted to make publicly for a number of years, and I have run out of good reasons to delay it." Renata set down her water glass. Northline Collective began in a workshop in Carlton Place with more ambition than operating capital. The person who made our first decade possible is not someone most of you have met because he has never sought credit for what he did. He is a craftsman who understands, better than most people I know, that what you build matters less than how you build it. Sylvester looked up. "Aldous Fenwick, would you please come forward?" The room shifted. Heads turned. From the back, moving at the unhurried pace of a man who sees no reason to rush, Aldous walked the length of the ballroom. He did not look at Renata's table. He looked at Sylvester, who was watching him with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has been patient for a long time. At the podium, they shook hands. The grip of two men who had trusted each other through difficult years and had both been proven right. Aldous looked out at the room. He let the silence sit for a moment. "My name is Aldous Fenwick. I run a furniture workshop on Leard Street in Hintonburg. Most days I have sawdust in my hair and wood stain on my hands. I mention that because it's the context, not the apology." A few genuine laughs, the kind that come from recognition. 12 years ago, I walked into a workshop in Carlton Place to repair a floor, and I met a man who was building something real. I believed in it. So I invested in it. Quietly, over time, beginning with my father's savings and continuing with everything the workshop could contribute, I built a position in Northline Collective. He paused. "As of this spring, I hold 31% of Northline's equity, making me the company's second-largest shareholder and the largest individual investor. I am sharing this tonight because recent circumstances have made continued privacy no longer something I can responsibly maintain." The room was still. "I am also announcing the establishment of the Fenwick Trades Foundation, which will provide apprenticeship funding and tools to young people in Renfrew County pursuing careers in the skilled trades. My father spent 30 years as a Finnish carpenter in Renfrew. He believed that knowing how to build something with your hands is one of the most honest ways a person can move through the world." He stepped back. The applause began slowly, the way real applause does, and built into something that brought several people to their feet before they had quite decided to stand. At the third table, Renata had not moved. Her champagne glass was in her hand. Her expression was the one people wear when the architecture of a story they have been living inside collapses in a single moment. Not shock exactly, but the cold adjustment of a mind that has just discovered the map was wrong. Tristan Vogt leaned toward her and said something. She did not respond. This is what researchers describe as schema disruption, the experience of confronting information that cannot be integrated into your existing understanding of the world without dismantling significant portions of that understanding. Renata had built a version of their marriage in which she was the one with professional standing, financial ambition, a future. Aldous had been the background, quiet, comfortable, temporary, she had told herself, though she had never used that word aloud. The background had just spoken in front of 200 people. Aldous returned to his seat near the back of the room. He did not look satisfied. He did not look vindicated. He looked like what he was, a man who had done a difficult thing and was glad it was done. What happened next was not something he had planned. Near the side of the room, in a chair along the wall reserved for guests of guests, sat an older woman, perhaps 65. A well-made but clearly aged blazer, the kind of face that had absorbed a great deal and complained about very little. Her name was Josephine. Not the Josephine in the file, a different one entirely. Josephine Martel, Renata's mother, who had taken the bus from her apartment in Vanier that evening because her daughter had called 3 days ago and told her she should come, that there would be something worth seeing. Josephine Martel had spent 30 years working in the linen department of the old Zellers on Rideau Street, and then, after it closed, at a series of jobs that kept the lights on, and not much else. She had raised Renata alone after her husband left when Renata was 9. She had made sure there were school supplies every September and a hot meal every evening, and a clear message that her daughter would not be defined by the size of the apartment they lived in. She had also, 14 months ago, received a diagnosis that had used the words stage 2 and required treatment, and created a financial gap that her provincial coverage did not fully close. Renata had known. She had told her mother to hold on, that she was looking into options, that things would sort themselves out. She had been managing 2 simultaneous crises and had managed neither of them well. What Renata had not known, because Aldous had made sure of it, was that the gap had been closed. Through a patient assistance program administered by the Ottawa Hospital Foundation, a private contribution had covered the remaining costs of Josephine Martel's treatment, surgery, medication, follow-up appointments, the transportation costs that accumulate quietly and relentlessly for people who do not own a car. All of it, 14 months ago, anonymously. Aldous returned to the podium one final time. "There is one more thing," he said. The room quieted again. Something in his tone told people to pay attention. "Last spring, a woman I know was navigating a significant medical situation. The treatment costs exceeded what her coverage provided, and the gap was not small. Through the Ottawa Hospital Foundation, an anonymous contribution was made to cover those costs in full: surgery, care, follow-up, and transportation." He looked at the side of the room. "That woman is Josephine Martel, and she is Renata's mother." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room full of people simultaneously understands something true, and the understanding lands somewhere below language. Josephine Martel stood from her chair along the wall. She was not a tall woman, but she walked through the room with the particular dignity of someone who has carried things for a long time and does not need to perform it. People moved aside without being asked. She reached the front of the room, where Aldous had stepped down from the podium to meet her. She held him for a long moment, her hands on his back, his stillness that made it clear he was not going anywhere. "You didn't have to," she said. "I know," he said, which was the whole answer. Someone near the middle of the room was studying the tablecloth with more concentration than tablecloths typically require. A board member named Gerald, who had attended every one of these dinners for 12 years and had a professional reputation for composure, appeared to find the centerpiece arrangement suddenly very interesting. At the third table, Renata was crying. Not the composed kind, both hands pressed against her face, the composure she had spent years assembling coming undone in a room full of people she had spent years impressing. Beside her, Tristan Vogt, who had nothing useful to offer, was checking his phone for reasons that had nothing to do with the phone. The statement piece, the upgrade, the man who belonged at this level. Aldous collected his coat from the chair at the back and walked out through the lobby and into the May evening on Wellington Street. The canal was still and dark. A few late cyclists on the pathway. The city doing what cities do at night, going about its business without needing anyone's permission. He drove home to his apartment on Percy Street in Centertown, where he had moved 3 weeks after the conversation he had overheard in the kitchen on Faraday Street. It was a third-floor walk-up with original hardwood floors and windows that faced west. And he had spent 2 weekends sanding and oiling those floors by hand, because that is what you do when something is worth doing correctly. The consequences that followed the evening at the Chateau Laurier arrived the way spring arrives in Ottawa, slowly and then all at once, with more force than the first mild day suggests. Tristan Vogt, it emerged in the weeks following, had been managing a property transaction that involved funds he did not entirely own, and a timeline that depended heavily on Renata's cooperation, and the assumption that a quiet divorce settlement would produce accessible capital. When that assumption collapsed publicly, the transaction collapsed with it. The details were not pleasant, and Tristan did not handle them well. He handled them the way people handle things when the performance they have built their life inside turns out to have no structural core, with volume, and then with silence. The architectural firm where Renata worked had been aware, in the way firms are aware of things they choose not to address directly, that her personal situation was complicated. After the evening at the Chateau Laurier, it became simpler. Several clients who had been part of that room found reasons to reassess their relationships with firms whose partners were navigating public embarrassments. The divorce was finalized in October. Aldous did not contest the house. He did not fight over the shared accounts. His lawyer, Hortense Quillen, negotiated an arrangement that was fair and clean, and she had told him more generous than it needed to be. "You know that," she had said. "I know," he had said. "I'm not interested in what it needed to be." He had moved into the Percy Street apartment and built the furniture for it himself. A dining table in white oak, a bookshelf in walnut, a bed frame in white ash with hand-cut dovetail joints at the corners. Not because anyone would see them, but because they were the right joint for the application. And Aldous was not in the habit of doing things incorrectly, simply because no one was watching. He had continued going to the workshop on Lyard Street every morning at 6:30. He had continued the commission list, which had grown to 4 months by November. He had continued calling Josephine Martel on Sunday afternoons to check in, and she had continued calling him son in a way that cost him something each time, and he was glad to pay it. In November, a woman named Philippa Sands had called the workshop about a commission, a kitchen island in reclaimed elm, specific dimensions, specific hardware. She was a structural engineer who had been referred by Sylvester Fontaine. When she came in to discuss the piece, she had looked around the workshop with the evaluative attention of someone who assesses structures professionally, and said, without preamble, that the joint construction on the piece currently in process was not what she had expected. "What did you expect?" Aldous had asked. "Something faster," she said. "You're cutting by hand. The piece is better for it." "I can see that," she said, not conceding the point, acknowledging the evidence. They had talked about the commission for 40 minutes and about other things for an hour after that. Philippa had strong opinions about building standards, structural redundancy, and the endemic overuse of engineered lumber in Canadian residential construction. Aldous had strong opinions about the difference between joinery that holds and joinery that merely looks like it holds. They found, in the way of people who take their work seriously, that they had more to say to each other than either of them had anticipated. She came back the following week to see the commission progress. Then, the week after. By January, they had been to dinner 3 times at a Vietnamese restaurant on Somerset Street in Chinatown, where the pho was excellent and the booths were the kind that make a long conversations feel like the right length. Philippa did not ask about the gala evening at the Chateau Laurier. She had heard about it, the way things circulate in a city the size of Ottawa, but she did not bring it up because she had decided, with the logic of an engineer, that it was relevant to what had happened to Aldous and not to who he was. Those were different categories, and she was precise enough to keep them separate. What she saw was the man who arrived at the workshop before his staff, the man who left the light on in the finishing room for his apprentice on late evenings, the man who had repaired a section of the back staircase in Josephine Martel's apartment building on a Saturday morning in December without being asked because he had noticed it needed doing. "You do a lot of things without being asked," she said one evening, over the pho on Somerset Street. "It's easier," he said. "Easier than what? Than waiting to be noticed." She had set down her chopsticks and looked at him for a long moment, with the direct, accurate attention of a person who is accustomed to understanding how things actually work. Psychologists who study what they call self-determination theory, the framework for understanding what motivates human beings to act, have identified 3 core needs that, when genuinely met, produce lasting psychological well-being. Autonomy, the sense that your actions come from within rather than from external pressure. Competence, the experience of doing something real and doing it well. And connection, the feeling of being genuinely known and genuinely valued by the people whose opinion you have decided to trust. For most of his adult life, Aldous had had 2 of the 3 in abundance. He was about to have all of them. The Fenwick Trades Foundation held its first information session in February at the workshop on Leard Street. 19 young people attended, 14 from Renfrew County, 5 from Ottawa's East End. Several had been told by school guidance counselors that their interests were not academic. Several had been told, in the indirect way that adults communicate limits to young people, that their particular kind of intelligence was not the kind that would take them very far. Aldous had organized the chairs, brewed the coffee, and spent 45 minutes explaining exactly how a traditional hand-cut mortise and tenon joint works and why it has held furniture together for 3,000 years. He talked about wood movement and grain direction, and the difference between a fastener that holds under load and one that holds under both load and time. He talked about the difference between things that look solid and things that are solid. The room was very quiet. Sylvester Fontaine came as a guest speaker and talked about starting a company with no money and 1 workshop and a very stubborn belief that buildings should be made to last. He was, without question, the most popular person in the room. By March, the foundation had 18 formal applicants for its first cohort of 6 funded apprenticeships. The waiting list for the second cohort was already forming. Aldous taught the Thursday morning session himself and intended to keep doing so indefinitely. He wanted the young people in those chairs to see the man who had funded the program arriving in work clothes and getting his hands into the material alongside them. He wanted them to understand that the distance between where they were standing and where they were going was real but crossable, and that the crossing happened 1 Thursday morning at a time. His father had taught him that, not in a classroom, and not with a speech. He had taught it by showing up to his own workshop every morning for 30 years, regardless of how the day before had ended or how the day ahead looked. One Thursday morning in April, a young man with the quick, slightly frustrated energy of someone whose mind works faster than his hands have yet learned to work, was struggling with a marking gauge and getting louder about it. "It keeps slipping," he said, with the tone of someone who believes the tool is the problem. "It's slipping because you're pulling instead of pushing the wood against the fence," Aldous said from 2 feet away. "Try it the other way." The young man tried it. The gauge ran clean and true along the grain. He looked at Aldous. Why didn't anyone tell me that before? You didn't try it before, Aldous said. Now you know. He handed him the next piece of stock without further comment. There was a lesson in that, too. In the withholding of the speech that wasn't needed. In the trust that the point had been made sufficiently by the doing of the thing. It was a Thursday in April in Ottawa. The Ottawa River had broken up 3 weeks earlier. The maples in Hintonburg were coming out in that early, tentative green that never quite looks real after a long winter. The workshop smelled of white oak and linseed oil and fresh coffee from the machine in the back corner that Aldous's senior cabinet maker, a meticulous man who had been with the workshop 7 years, kept running from 7 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon without interruption. Aldous looked around at the room, at the young man working the marking gauge with new confidence, at the commission in progress on the center bench, a writing desk in quarter-sawn white oak that he had been quietly looking forward to for 2 months, at the afternoon light coming through the north windows, at the angle that always made the grain in the wood do something extraordinary. He understood, doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. Not because someone had told him so, not because anyone was watching, because the work was real and the people in the room were real and the foundation his father had laid. Not in any document, not in any account, but in the slow, patient demonstration of what it means to show up and care about what you're doing. That foundation had held. Renata was rebuilding her life in the gradual, complicated way of someone who has had to examine the parts of themselves that are hardest to examine. She had left the architectural firm in January. She was doing independent consulting work, which was harder and quieter, and, by her own admission to her therapist, more honest than anything she had done in years. She was learning the difference, painful, specific, not completed in a day, between building a life from ambition and building one from actual values. It was taking longer than she wanted. She was doing it anyway. Josephine Martel called Aldous every Sunday, and he always answered, and they talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. She had started a small gardening project on the balcony of her Vanier apartment. She sent him photographs of the progress. He texted back single words of assessment that she had learned to interpret with the precision of someone who understands the language. Thriving. That meant she had done something right. Philippa came to the workshop on a Friday afternoon in late April to see the completed kitchen island in reclaimed elm that had started everything. She walked around it twice, ran her hand along the top, checked the joint at the corner with her thumbnail in the way of someone testing a structure. "It's right," she said. "It is," Aldous agreed. She turned and looked at him. There was something in the expression that said she was about to say something she had been thinking about for some time. "You know what you're doing," she said. "I know what I'm doing in here," he said. "The rest I'm still working out." "That's the part I find reassuring," she said. He had smiled, the real kind, the one that takes up less space than it used to, because it no longer needed to reassure anyone of anything. Later that evening, he sat on the front step of the building on Percy Street with a cup of coffee and watched the neighborhood settle into its Friday evening pace. The last light on the western windows of the building across the street. A family walking a dog that had its own clear opinion about which direction was worth going. Somewhere, probably a few blocks east, the smell of something being grilled. He thought about his father, about the tools that now hung in the workshop, oiled and organized and used every week, about what it means to pass something on, not the thing itself, but the intention behind it. The decision to take care with your work and the people around it, made quietly, without requiring applause. He thought about the young man with the marking gauge. He thought about Josephine Martel's photographs of tomato plants on a Vanier balcony. He thought about Philippa, who assessed structures honestly and had decided, with the precision of an engineer, that this one was worth her time. He drank his coffee. The city moved around him at the unhurried pace that cities have when you stop needing them to hurry. He was, without question, and without needing anyone's confirmation of the fact, genuinely at peace. The foundation beneath that peace had not been built in a night, or a year, or even a decade. It had been built on every morning he had arrived at the workshop before anyone else. Every commission completed with more care than was strictly necessary. Every quiet thing done for someone who needed it without waiting for the occasion to require it. That kind of foundation does not announce itself. It does not glitter under ballroom chandeliers or arrive in a tailored suit to make a point. It holds the weight that gets put on it, season after season, without asking to be thanked for holding, which is exactly why it holds.